Victoria Blackwell adjusted the sleeve of her tailored coat as she pushed into the throng at JFK International Airport's International Terminal. Around her, the environment was populated with a mix of travelers and announcements blasting across the space. Her image was an intentional fabrication, designed not just from a desire for beauty, but from a profound ritualization gained over years of following standards she had taken for granted. She was 52, and she knew how quickly the world made its judgments, often before a word was spoken. She had prepped herself, lacquered, poised, and certainly lovely, in a way that brooked no disagreement. She walked through the terminal with calm precision, her suitcase following her like a shadow that knew where it was going. Families clustered about her. Visitors eyeballed the departure boards with avid attention, and airport officials called out boarding groups in calm, practiced accents. Victoria Blackwell was not aware of the noise of the airport around her. She was elsewhere in her mind. It was about what lay ahead for her. Flight 237 to Heathrow was quite the voyage, not just in the act of flying, but in the emotion of a chapter closing in real time. His daughter's wedding was a grand affair, full of delight and rejoicings. It was a huge thing of her life, and family and friends came together for the celebration of the union of two souls. The whole world came together to celebrate this glorious event. The atmosphere was filled with passion and affection. The faintest hint of it gripped something deep inside her chest. It was not because she doubted the marriage itself, but rather she doubted all the marriage stood for. Introductions were made. Dinners were set up. Discussions were methodically planned over years. Delicate chats between families, testing compatibility as though judging fickleness of weather forecasts. This wedding was not just another party. It was a proclamation. A height of success has been reached. A demonstration of how every sacrifice, every wise choice, and well-selected phrase has built up a foundation that is both secure and revered through the years. Victoria Blackwell had constructed her life around the belief that vital matters were never to be left to chance. She stopped at a couple of departure screens and her phone buzzed a little. She glanced down. She would suspected it before, but a message from her husband proved it. Everything in London, England was set, and in place as predicted. Everything about the setting, the people, the last elements had been painstakingly planned, each one working to mold the whole experience to come. The mood was beautifully done, and there was a feeling of excitement as all came together. The seating chart itself had been gone over twice with a fine-tooth comb, by people who knew that in their world, the placement of people was never left to chance. The seats were a bit of a pip to the arrangement. The intimacy of those who were nearby was considerably more significant in its meaning. She hesitated as if she were considering before speaking. Instead, she concentrated on the screen that displayed the status of Flight 237, too late, 3/4 of an hour. It was a slight inconvenience, not a concern, but enough to give her jaw a little bit of a workout, time she respected. Not because she was afraid of being late, but because she knew a delay would show the reality, the fundamental truth of how little control humanity has, no matter how meticulously you might organize your life. Victoria Blackwell continued toward the gate at a steady, deliberate pace. She was the kind of person that drew a quiet kind of attention, and she had slowly learned to accept this as part of her life. It was a sentiment that went beyond admiration and hate. Something more involved. How people perceive others when they make quick judgments, frequently before the person has had the opportunity to prove their merit for such assessments. She did not modify her face to see it, and she always did. Travelers filed into the waiting area at Gate B42 and settled into the rowdy surroundings. Business class returned to its normal routine. Laptops were opened, headphones were put in place, and the talk slowly dissipated into little pockets of silence. Victoria Blackwell sat a bit apart from the others. Not that she was unsociable, but that she liked everything in its place. Distance gave everything a new clarity. Clarity was a barrier, so there was no risk of misinterpretation. She put her bags down next to her, crossed her legs, and let her eyes wander over the gate. That was when she noticed them. The family has chosen to make the neighborhood their home and exchange friendly words with each other. They devoted care and attention to their travel-stained, battered bags. They had a closeness that went above superficialities or social standing. They spoke so that they moved closer. Speaking was less important than listening. Victoria Blackwell quickly turned her gaze away, not with disdain, but with habit, her mind soaked in information. She grouped it and threw it away. As an adult, she would lived a lifetime in locations where the capacity to take a room's measure in an instant was not only useful, it was required. One learns to scrutinize every detail even when one may seem uninterested. Then a boarding call burst out over the PA system of the terminal, attracting all eyes in the vicinity. The delay had not affected the speed of the airport, only shifted it a little, like holding your breath for a long time, then letting it go. Victoria Blackwell opened her phone and moved her fingers across the screen, scrolling back through the last few weeks of photographs. Photos of the rehearsal dinner, photos of decor at the venue, and carefully thought-out lists of attendees who had RSVP'd and guests who hadn't. Masterly in every detail. Everything pointed to a well-oiled machine, provided everyone played their part in the plan we had all agreed to. There was a faint emotion that drifted beneath the surface of the images, a stress she hardly admitted, no fear. Not utter surety, but some question. It's like learning that perfection is delicate and requires ongoing vigilance to sustain it, like the work of carrying water in cupped hands and walking into a gale. She put her phone away and stared through the glass of the boarding gate. This was the moment to relocate people. Lines are starting to form, conversations are getting longer. Farewells are getting real. The plane to London, England was ready to get back on track, and with it Victoria Blackwell's carefully prepared timeline was ready to move forward again. Carefully she stood up and readjusted her coat and looked for her bag. She paused for a while, since something inside of her always changed in these moments, not because anything outside of her did. Transits brought forth ideas she usually buried and presented them as she rarely allowed. Her identity was evident, strongly defined. This adventure, a mothering spirit, partner. For years, a woman had made sure there was no question mark hanging over any detail of her family. She took a step toward the boarding line with a faint, unarticulated sense that the cosmos she had crafted with such care was not as solid as it appeared. It never has. The atmosphere changed the moment Victoria Blackwell entered into the business class cabin. She sensed it immediately but would never admit to. It was not a big noise. It was not pandemonium. It was the other way around, really. Shiny lighting, plush leather seats, the peaceful hum of a well-maintained airliner getting set for a long, faraway flight. Everything appeared designed for comfort, for accuracy, for constraint. But the more she was there, the more she felt her outlook shift. It was not the cabin, it was the people in it. She walked gently down the aisle, the smooth, controlled rhythm of her shoes on the carpeted floor. She passed each chair and it told her a narrative, not in words, but in fact. A passenger putting their suitcase in the overhead storage, and how someone else had their tie a bit too slack, as if formality was optional, but not required. A toddler squirmed in his seat, unaware of how sound travels through compact spaces. Victoria Blackwell did not say a word. She did not do this often in such instances. She was a better judge than that, a subtler one. In silences, in looks, in the mind's inventory of what seemed right and what didn't. But she assured herself that was only knowing. Skill she would developed over the years at events when the details mattered more than the pronouncements. In her world, you learned quickly that restraint was frequently achievement. Excess was not finesse. Too much movement, too much noise, no sense of surrounds. But in her allotted seat, she was more and more aware of how quickly that awareness could turn into something else. Whether she was exhausted, depressed, or just alone with her own thoughts. The passengers were boarding around her. Behind her, a group of individuals whispered in a tongue she could not name. Their laughing was muted but frequent, rising and falling in a cadence she could not guess. A few rows forward, a man was fiddling with his headphones, punching his screen over and over as if the technology owed him faster responses. Victoria Blackwell stepped aside, put down her handbag, and smoothed the fabric of her coat. She told herself she was only watching. It was a good comment. It was a poor comment. Required. Professional, particularly the way she usually played in areas where standards were unwritten but severely enforced. But the threshold between seeing and interpreting had always been a delicate one, and she had always been skilled at crossing it unknowingly. Her gaze wandered again, not deliberately but instinctively. A family sat across the way. The father gingerly stowed their carry-on into the overhead. The woman glanced at a kid at the window, with a simplicity that was almost beguiling, flicked a strand of hair from the kid's face. A small youngster kicked its legs and shouted eagerly about something beyond its limited universe, unseen and unheard. Victoria Blackwell's chest felt a little tight, but she would have said another word if asked. She'd have termed it an appreciation for order. For the room's sake, in shared areas, mutual respect is a must. She had said things like that before, and they had always seemed convincing when they were stated, but something harder was building inside her. She saw that several passengers didn't quiet down right away. How the talks went on too long. How individual comfort seems to triumph occasionally over a communal consciousness. She saw clearly how some people got through life without ever stopping to think of the effect they had on those around them. And without really wishing to, her mind began to make sense of those observations. Not truths, rationales. She shifted a little in her chair, crossed her legs with practiced correctness. The cabin crew moved along the aisle with practiced professionalism, exchanged greetings, checked seat belts, replaced overhead containers with swift elegance. That was the sort of order Victoria Blackwell liked. This was a comfort to her. She felt it should be a norm in locations like these. But they didn't all clear that hurdle. A child's sudden chuckle, a loud noise breaking the background hum of talk. It wasn't disruptive in any technical sense, but nevertheless at that time it felt out of place to her. It was uncontrolled, but not bad. Victoria Blackwell stared quickly that way and then away. She convinced herself she wasn't judging. Harsh was too strong a term, too much emotion, too severe in itself. She believed she was assessing how well she belonged to the environment. She liked it a lot. It felt right, almost clinical, something that would remove the personal prejudice, but the longer she watched, the more the cottage seemed to be pulling itself apart in her view. Not literally, but theoretically, those who knew the space and those who just lived in it. The ones that made it, the ones that just lived in it without altering. For years, she lived in places where to be part of anything was to be accepted. Board meetings, charity galas, family gatherings where every aspect was more vital. In these regions, cash was awareness, respect was a delicate thing. When she saw conduct that didn't fit that underlying framework, she felt something she couldn't really name. No rage, no worries, more dissonance. The jet began to inch slowly away from the gate. The lights in the cabin dimmed slowly as if to signal a change. A calm, trained voice came over the speakers, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 237 and detailing the delight ahead. Victoria Blackwell listened, but not really. Her eyes roamed about her, weighing everything by some unseen standard she had not set up, but which she always carried with her. And that standard came to feel, without my realizing it, less like observation and more like isolation. Not in people, but what she imagined this location ought to be, and what it really was. Patience did not fall all in one piece, but this is rarely so. It began with something so nearly invisible for Victoria Blackwell. Blackwell, a tightening in her shoulders, a slightly longer gap between breaths, a dawning realization that the cabin was not the controlled atmosphere she'd pictured when she'd come on board. The airplane itself was just the same as it had been. The lights were dimmed, the chairs were arranged in rows, and the personnel moved with trained precision. But people, she thought, were not always quite as predictable as systems, and it was with this idea, though she would not have said it quite so baldly, that the transition started. First came little interruptions, a speech that ventured too far into common ground. The mechanical seat adjustment seems clicky, the soft rattle of a child's voice, rising and falling without regularity, not disturbing in itself but cumulative in effect. Every moment alone would have been nothing. Together they started to merge into something heavier in her perception. Victoria Blackwell moved again, a little and then more determinedly, as though to win control of her body was to gain control of her mind. She said to herself that she was not easily upset. She would have walked into boardrooms where choices involving millions of dollars were made under duress. She would sat through dinners where every sentence had a subtext. She had built a life on her ability to handle things, not react to them. But an airplane cabin was odd in a way she seldom allowed herself to acknowledge. It was closed in, shared, inevitable. There was no departure that did not need time, coordination, and social acknowledgement. And in that sort of milieu, even tiny discomforts could start to reverberate more loudly than they should. The flight attendants came down the aisle again, handing out water, checking seat belts, adjusting overhead bins that would not close properly the first time. Victoria Blackwell watched them with cautious admiration. Their depiction was structure, predictability, a hierarchy that does not cause emotional upheaval. It was not long before Victoria Blackwell spoke when one of them paused next her row. Her voice was low, yet there was an edge to it, not loud so much as expectant. This part is a little noisy. She waved a bit but didn't point at anyone. It's hard to stay still. Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell reacted pleasantly, reassuringly, the usual phrase about ensuring passenger comfort, about trying their utmost to keep a calm environment. Victoria Blackwell nodded, but her face did not soften sufficiently, because in her mind the answer was not as exact as the problem was. She didn't want to be understood. She was demanding to know when she had been wronged. Victoria Blackwell leaned back as flight attendant. Ryan Mitchell walked away, but her eyes were alert, watching every movement around her. The cabin was settling down to flight, but she was feeling more and more out of tune with it. The murmur of talk came in waves she could not anticipate or filter. Behind her, a short burst of laughing, then a softer talk that went for longer than she considered appropriate in a shared, enclosed area. And below all this, she began to feel something that she hardly admitted to herself. Swings. Non-tangible. Socially, as if the others did not play by the unwritten rules she would always depended on. Her eyes moved back to the folks she had seen before, and they were still there, still together, still living in a way that felt a bit too real to her. Not because they did anything wrong, objectively, but because they were not modulated in their presence. Uncensored, they took up space as if space was just there to be taken up. Victoria Blackwell felt a faint pulse of displeasure, and this time she didn't hide it away immediately. She let it grow an idea instead. Why does not anybody else know? Once asked, the question would not be easily shrugged off. She moved a step nearer and beckoned again to a flight attendant. She was more forceful this time, less conciliatory in her tone. "I know people are settling in," she said carefully, using words that made sense but had an undertone of dissatisfaction. "But some order has to be dealt with. This is first class. People are trying to sleep, to work, get ready for a long flight." Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell heard it and kept his professional poise. Again they nodded, another polite assurance. But Victoria Blackwell could sense the boundaries of their response. They were facilitators, not enforcers. They could see discomfort, but could not reframe behavior on the go. And that really bothered her more than she thought it would, because, in her opinion, issues had solutions. And moved solutions. Victoria Blackwell let out a leisurely breath through her nose, a controlled release of stress that didn't quite fix anything as flight attendant Ryan Mitchell went on. She looked forward again, and this time she was alert. It was bustling, scanning, measuring, weighing up. The cabin was less communal, it seemed. It was a group of folks who had not yet conformed to any assumed standard. Another child laughed, louder this time, and then a short conversation from an adult telling them to hush. It was a quick sound, but enough to make something fall inside of Victoria Blackwell. Not for eruption, but for clarity of displeasure. She reached for her call button once again. This time, when flight attendant Ryan Mitchell showed in, Victoria Blackwell did not keep her mouth shut. "Normal travel noise is one thing and lack of concern is another," she said. "I think that boundary is being crossed right now." Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell pondered a little longer, then said, still chilly, still cautious. Again they said they'd take care of it, that they appreciated her reaching out, they would do everything they could. They went. Victoria Blackwell leaned forward, hands clenched tighter than before. Something wasn't right. Not in the cockpit. In her reading of the book, once little irritations were neutral assessments. They were starting to build an account she hadn't consciously selected, but was increasingly harder to ignore. The plane began its slow climb into the sky, and Victoria Blackwell discovered that she was more than a passenger in an atmosphere. She was one who could evaluate, if not the light, then at least the air was good enough now. Victoria Blackwell. Blackwell did not at first raise her voice. That meant something to her even now. To her, control was never about how loud you were. It was a matter of accuracy, about the precise moment when silence was no longer enough. Years of being in rooms where decisions were made, not with shouting, but with results that lasted for months, told her that. But something had shifted in her in the last half hour of the flight. It wasn't a one-time thing, accumulating. Laughter. The discussions overlap. The little thoughtless things that seemed harmless on their own, but piled up to a pattern she could no longer overlook. To Victoria Blackwell, it felt less like a community and more like a system that was slowly becoming out of whack. And in her world, systems were meant to hold. She leaned a little into the aisle, waiting for flight attendant Ryan Mitchell to pass. Victoria Blackwell did not hesitate when she finally drew near. "Excuse me," she said evenly, but with a harshness to her voice. "It's getting harder and harder to put up with this." Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell froze, remained professional, but his look was intent and neutral. Victoria Blackwell pressed on. "I know folks are getting situated," she said, "but there is a distinction between ordinary travel and absolute ignorance of others. This cabin is supposed to be up to a certain quality." She did not say these people, she didn't have to. Her words conveyed something unnamed, and in many respects that made them heavier. Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell answered with professional poise, reassuring the passenger of his comfort, of watching the situation, of doing their best to give a quiet environment. But Victoria Blackwell was no longer listening for comfort. She listened for the voice of command, but she did not listen. Her eyes roamed around the cottage again. A tiny boy squirmed in his seat. A voice rose slightly above the discussion. A light clattering came through the room as something dropped into a tray. None of it is of any importance. Together, it made for, she thought, a slow erosion of order. She blew a gentle breath. "This is business class," she said again more forcefully now, her tone still controlled, but no longer comforting. "People have paid for a certain level of comfort and respect. That expectation is not occurring." A few passengers around gave a small nod. Not so much, just enough to catch the tone. The energy shift, of course, Victoria Blackwell did see. She was always seeing, but instead of retreating, something inside her surged forward. The attention alone was enough to make her complaint valid enough to be heard, even if it was uncomfortable attention. Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell nodded again, but this time his expression tightened a fraction. No, not disagreement. No agreement either. More of a constraint, perhaps, and they claimed they will pass on my worries, but Victoria Blackwell did not want it. Passing along was not an action. Diffusion, and from her experience, diffusion seldom made a difference. She moved herself a bit further round the aisle, and her voice was now heard more than before. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge of this cabin," she stated. No other communication went through. The boss man, this time the words sank indifferently in the surroundings. Not exactly a complaint, more a matter of hierarchy. Flight attendant Ryan Mitchell paused a bit. Then he answered, I can ask the lead crew member to come talk to you. I think that would be appropriate, Victoria Blackwell answered immediately. No argument was in her voice. Victoria Blackwell leaned back into her seat, not in relaxation as flight attendant Ryan Mitchell walked away. She sat poised and alert. Her hands met, fingers locking just a little more tightly than before. She told herself she was only keeping standards high. Someone had to voice what everyone else was obviously thinking but was too nice to express. The framework only existed while it was enforced. But with that reasoning, something else was steadily surfacing. A need for validation, not emotional assent. Structural, proof she was not the only one to recognize the imbalance she witnessed. The cabin around her went on, unknowing or indifferent with the shift in her psychic framework. The conversation continued, the snap of a seatbelt. The tray table shifted. Life at the cottage continued as if nothing had happened. But Victoria Blackwell had something. Now she was not only seeing discomfort, she was going to kick it up a notch. Some minutes elapsed, then Chief Purser Angela Reeves came in. But they were different, more grounded, more tuned into the cabin as a system, not just a complaint. That she could feel immediately. They didn't respond immediately. They assessed, they took in, they spoke with caution. Good evening, ma'am, said the senior attendant. I understand you're having an issue with the cabin environment. Victoria Blackwell did not relax her face. I do, she said, and it is not small. She waited for the words to sink in and continued on. There's a degree of disarray in this cabin that's impacting the whole experience. There is more than problems. That is not nice, and it is maintained. The head attendant said nothing, but at that point Victoria Blackwell was not speaking only to the crew. She was talking to the structure of the surroundings themselves. She felt with growing conviction that the structure must be rectified, even if it meant bringing someone above. Someone she took for the voice from above. The captain. The cabin felt different when he arrived. It wasn't announced, not in any grand way. There was no warning, no change in the illumination, no hint that someone significant was entering the room, but somehow they felt it before they comprehended it. The cabin's forward motion was starting to slow. Without anybody asking for quiet, people muted their conversations. Even the tiniest restlessness of motion seemed to hold its breath for a fraction of a second, as if the aircraft itself had taken a breath and was waiting. Victoria Blackwell saw it in a moment. She had been around enough leadership figures to know presence before identification. Some people entered a room and made it noisy. Others walked in and made less noise just by being there. This was the second type. The man who entered the aisle wore the outfit as naturally as if it were not a costume, but something that had become part of him through years of repetition. He stood still but not rigid. His expression was calm but not empty. There was something in his eyes that told him he would been awake longer than most people thought. Captain Dominic Reynolds. He did not say anything at first. He just moved steadily forward, neither hurried nor reluctant. Every step was taken with the precise precision of thousands of hours when no choice could be hurried without cost. He drew near, and Victoria Blackwell steeled herself a little in her seat. Instinct, not respect yet. This was the one she had ordered. The last word. The framework she thought would address what had been building up in her mind for the last hour. The lead flight attendant said to him in a low voice, in short, meticulous terms, summing up the situation. Victoria Blackwell could not hear all of it, but she did not need to. She could see what it was made of. A worry expressed. A cabin setting that is described as inconsistent. A call to action. She waited for him to reply as authority figures typically did. Edit, clarify, comfort, put things right. But Captain Reynolds did none of these things at once. Instead, he concentrated his focus on Victoria Blackwell. Nope, not fast, not so severely. Just totally. The kind of attention that did not judgment right away but took everything all in at once. Victoria Blackwell looked into his eyes. But before he could say anything, she responded, "This is unacceptable now." Her voice was steady, but there was something more definite beneath it now. Belief. The ambiance in this cabin is not what passengers deserve at this type of service. The words were exact. Organized. The manner facts should be given when the facts mattered and clarity was essential. The captain did not come in. He did not answer. He just listened. And that, in itself, started to move the energy in the space again. For the silence of authority is never neutral. It either verifies or denies everything that came before it. Victoria Blackwell saw his quietness as him thinking of her, processing appraisal. Then she went on. "I'm not talking about a single incident," she added. "It is the common practice, the ignorance, the breakdown of common space. It's impacting the experience of everyone who expects a particular standard here." For the first time, the captain's face showed a slight emotion. No disagreements. Not agreed to recognition. Not at her end. But the emotional heft behind that. At last he spoke. He was quiet and serene. Not as much as expected. Not authoritative as people so frequently thought of authority sounding, but controlled in a different way, a way defined by duty rather than by status. I understand your anxiety, he stated simply. At those comments, Victoria Blackwell felt a little inward approval. At last, acknowledgments. Structure responding to structure. But then something unexpected occurred. He did not turn away. His eyes were not on the crew. Instead, he hesitated. A pause so long it felt like it was on purpose. Then he said something that changed the whole cabin in a way no one saw coming. He said, I have been seeing the things that are happening in this cabin. There was a calm strain in the air. And I need to be clear, he said. Pause again. This situation is no longer suited for me to continue operating this flight safely. Most of the passengers did not instantly absorb the words, but Victoria Blackwell heard them all. Not on an emotional level. Structurally, her mind tried to process them as it processed complex situations. Categorize, understand, resolve. Not good enough. For him, what did it mean in operational terms? She leaned a little forward. I'm sorry, she murmured, confusion creeping into her former confidence. So you're suggesting the cabin environment is unsafe because of passenger behavior? For a moment, the captain looked away from her, glancing up towards the front of the plane as if something larger than their talk had caught his attention. Then he spoke again. I'm stating that I'm not in a fit state to carry on with this flight under the present conditions. The cabin hadn't quite got it yet, but the crew didn't. Between them, there was a practiced instant exchange of stillness. Do not panic, not pandemonium, methods. Now Victoria Blackwell looked at him, wanting an explanation that would explain what she had just heard. This is a working flight, she said cautiously. You're the captain. I am, he responded. That was it. And that added weight to it somehow, because it set the precedent that this was not an escalation of procedure, it was a matter of choice. He drew back a little, as if he were already retreating from the part he had played a moment before. I am passing command of this flight to the first officer, he said coolly. There was a motion in the cabin which was not quite sound, nor entirely silence. It was kind of a halfway thing. For the first time since she had been on, Victoria Blackwell was frozen. Not that she was terrified, but because the structure she had been counting on to sort things out had just done something she had not factored in. It did not alter the surroundings, it pulled away from it. And in that lack all else seemed less secure than it had seemed before. The announcement was anticlimactic. And that is what made it feel like a dream. No heads up, no hurry in his speech, no emotional cushioning of the blow. It was a perfunctory announcement pushed through the aircraft speakers, faint, as though it were reporting a normal tweak rather than the collapse of a whole journey. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first officer. Then a silence. Victoria Blackwell felt it at once in her chest. Not fear, but the sudden understanding that something irrevocable was happening. Sorry. We hate to tell you that your flight will not be operating as scheduled owing to operational issues. For a moment the words failed to get through to the cabin. They hung in the air as though they were not quite finished, waiting to be read. Reality sunk its teeth in. A ripple of confusion ran through the passengers, then astonishment, then fragmented discussions in low, worried accents. People stared at each other as someone close would have more info than the system. For a moment, Victoria Blackwell did not move. Her intellect stumbled to absorb the announcement. Working circumstances? Too vague, too neutral. It had not stated why, it did not accuse. It only said result, that she might have been bothered by anything beyond rage. The plane had not gone wrong. Turbulence was never severe enough to require an evacuation. Cabin emergency precautions, nothing to see here. Then why not? She moved a little nearer the aisle where the chief flight attendant was now posing in another attitude. Still peaceful, but not the comfort of dealing. Now change. We shall go back to the gate, Flight Attendant Ryan Mitchell stated quietly. Passengers need to deplane carry-on items. The chaos was given shape by the phrases needed and deplane. The structure was not comprehended. Victoria Blackwell gently rose up, as if moving may help her locate the missing solution. People around her were opening overhead compartments, gathering baggage, staring at each other in perplexity. The cabin was another thing entirely now, smitten down, no sound, but dropped the intent. She glanced toward the front of the aircraft, searching for the captain or anybody with power to accept blame for what had just transpired, but that was no longer the case. Only the team moved fast enough to suggest decisions had already been taken elsewhere. Victoria Blackwell started down the aisle. For the first time since she had been on board, she felt something she did not at once know. Not torture, not mad, dislocation. The system she had been reviewing, judging, measuring, adjusting was not responding to her inputs anymore. It had gone straight over her head. She trailed the flow of travelers, gathering bits of talk. Why are we being abducted? This is nonsensical. Did someone do anything? The last question lingered a moment longer than the others. Did anybody get anything done? She eased her steps a little. Not enough to show anybody else, but enough to feel it inside. The answer in its least comfortable form was beginning to gel without permission. She walked to the galley area while crew members directed people off the flight. The air here was different. It was tight and procedural, closed in, no emotional outflow, no comments, execution only. Victoria Blackwell looked around the faces again, looking for an explanation. Then she listened. Not the first. No, not immediately. Not directed to her, but near enough. Behind her, somebody was talking to somebody else in a low voice. I think the captain has gone to bed. That line hit different, though. Not a rumor, but in consequence. Victoria Blackwell stopped in her walk for half a second. Then the captain came down. Her memories went back to before that time. His company, his quietness. He stated he could not continue with these conditions. She had perceived it as a show of authority in response to atmosphere at the time. But now it was different. It was like a pullout. Like the system didn't fix itself. It had stolen the authority from its highest point. She began again, slowly, more mindful of her surroundings. The tension in the cockpit, the confusion common, the slow evolution of passengers from travelers to those told to leave a sequence they had been banking on moments before. When I emerged from the interior lights of the cabin, the light of the jet bridge at the departure door seemed almost unreal. Passengers got out one by one. Some were annoying, a tiny bit silent. Some were already on the phones trying to make arrangements that were no longer there. Victoria Blackwell paused in the doorway. For a moment, she did not move on, not for getting stopped. But something in her had begun to discern the shape of what had transpired. More than a pause. Not just a complaint, not a process failure. It was a break in continuity from what she would declare, what she would insist on, what she would magnify thinking it would bring order. And suddenly, between the plane and the terminal, she saw something that she hadn't let herself think of previously. The system has not repaired others. It had come straight out of the picture, and she was still feeling its affects. This was not the silence of her. Not the silence of peace and privacy, but the silence that arrives when a name begins to lose its weight in other people's mouths. Victoria Blackwell was the first to see it, on her phone. No phones, no calls anymore. No call from any of the usual sources that had once made her day so easy, assistants and coordinators, lovers, social contacts, who had always reacted quickly, almost automatically. First, she told herself it was timing. Different time zones. The insect that flies on hold. Then the notifications began rolling in. No concern messages. Now on to the questions. Range conversations were replaced by concise, purpose-written emails. Invitations silently withdrawn. Meetings have been postponed till further notice. She understood that tone immediately, for she would use it many times herself, graceful leave taking under the cover of routine adjustment. The only strange thing was that it was now aimed toward her. She checked her phone 3 times before she even reached the dining area in the airport terminal. Less than a minute. Each refresh was the same pattern of information pouring out from her, not to her. And then there was the video. First, it wasn't a news outlet. It is from another place. A shaky yet audible recording by a passenger, her voice, the cabin itself. The ratchet up comes the skipper in front, a minute before it all changed. The internet did what it's good at with incomplete context, filled in the blanks, fast, confidently, and without permission. The headline options were coalescing quickly. Passenger complaint cancels flight captain, quits after incident on ship. Viral disruption in first class. Victoria Blackwell looked at the TV longer than she should. Not that she knew not herself, but she did. But it did not seem like real recognition. It was like exposure with no picture, a version of herself without context, intention, or internal logic. A version that had seen the world without the quiet rationale she had always assumed was part of her judgments. First immediate influence was Delta. Official letter. Language is polite, not an accusation, but not ambiguity. Her travel permissions are under review, and activities compromising operational safety and passenger environment are under inquiry. Safety and operations, words caught in her throat, because she did not call the safety, not in person. No, not all that much, but she had got into its language somehow. And there was the social level, the layer she always understood more intuitively than most other people. A planned luncheon was postponed indefinitely, a reconsideration of an invitation to the board. A well-worded statement from a charitable group she had headed for several years commended her on past services and wished her success in future pursuits. What is next? A word that means to gently close a door. Victoria Blackwell read the messages with increasing silence. No denial. Do not freak out. A little tighter something. Watched, gave up, for in that observation something unknown was beginning to form. A disconnect between the self she thought she was and how people were describing what she did now, not who she was going to become. Her effect, that difference, was more than she realized, and by sunset the video was racking up millions of views, discussion on commentary, Slow-motion shots, voices investigated, meaning, tone, connotation, strangers talked about. Others agreed with her on the issue. Others objected about what they regarded as entitlement coming out under duress. Neither of them knew her, but both of them was positive. That too was a thing she had not yet learned to adapt herself to in the current world, where perception did not wait for resolution to become judgment. It did not come from outside. The worst thing, it was a recognized fact, a note from Patricia Lang. Brief. We are not prepared to agree to that action. No salutation, no explanation other than what was already inferred. She read it, and then she put the phone down. And once more. Then he put it face down on the table, as if distance may diminish its importance. Outside her apartment window, the typical thrum of New York City went on. Cars passed, the lights moved. People ventured to places that had not been halted any place in the sky. But time was a bit out of tune in her realm, not ceasing, but not on the same frequency as the world out there. Victoria Blackwell sat down. For the first time since the airport, she didn't instantly try to structure or solve what had transpired. She left a question unresolved, and before her pending, when do people cease caring about intention? And for the first time since the journey had started, she had no system solution to replace it with. Getting a public reprimand was hard. That was another matter. In the weeks that followed, Victoria Blackwell discovered that reputations seldom shatter instantaneously. Slowly they wear away, like a coast whose sand is taken by each wave. It's a delicate process, and you feel like you can get back what was lost in the beginning. And then one day you look around you and the scenery's changed. Then her first opening in the family, not in a fight distance-wise. Distance is nice on average, but at the same time it is very heavy. Eliza Blackwell, her daughter, was the first to reply, but they came answers shorter than usual. Victoria Blackwell told herself that was good enough. Wedding preparations were nuts. London, England was boiling. The feelings were overwhelming. Do not think about it too much, she urged herself, but the gap between the replies widened. It was a question of hours now. A week of days passed, then another. Victoria Blackwell's answers were growing more and more one-sided. Just to check, hope you're doing well. Let me know if you need anything. The responses returned sounded careful, not insane, softly, and somehow it stung more. Connection is talking anger. People fight while they still have something to expect from each other. Care is normally a sign that expectations have already altered. Victoria Blackwell sat alone one night in her Manhattan penthouse, reading the note from Eliza Blackwell for the third time. Mom, I need some space right now. That's plenty. Only 12 words. But the 12 sentences were more emotionally distant than any dispute she could remember. Victoria Blackwell thought she was protecting her family for years, providing opportunities, stability of the building, working for a future where her daughter would never have to suffer what other generations had suffered before her. Now she pondered for the first time if difficult to tell difference was becoming protection and control. She thought about it after she had hung up the phone, and then the professional consequences. Blackwell Realty Group had never just been her husband's company. Victoria Blackwell had spent years building the relationships that would open doors, introduce individuals, and develop alliances. As an executive, she personally had little real power. Unofficially, she ran the show. Trust is the bedrock of influence. She was finding that trust leaves faster than money. Some groups withdrew from possible ventures quietly, lost an invitation to a conference. Leadership restructuring, said a foundation board. Lost old buddies without aggression. Not applicable. This term started appearing again and again. Everybody was busy. Everyone seems to be booked up. Everyone was out of town. The inclination seemed to be unavoidable. So one afternoon she attended a fundraiser, one she had been shoring up for nearly 8 years. It felt odd yet familiar walking inside the ballroom. The room was identical. The people all looked the same. The attitude had shifted quite a little. As she approached, everybody ceased talking. Not a lot. Not enough to get anyone charged with anything. To be looked at long enough. Here. Smile. A tip of the hat. And other things to do. Victoria Blackwell pretended to study instructional brochures for many minutes, documents she'd read months ago behind a display booth. No one was overtly rude. Nobody needed to be. Social marginalization is not announced. It just keeps revoking invites until someone gets the hint without even having to say anything. That night, she came home tired. Not literally, in an emotional way. For the first time for years, her flat felt too big. That was all the rooms were, I thought, made for a life that was no longer hers. The hush came with her through the rooms. Then a blow, hefty and unlooked for. All the best. Thomas Blackwell, her husband. Getty Images. They would been companions for almost 30 years, not necessarily a love partnership. Their marriage was one of teamwork, of aspiration, of a shared knowledge of the world they lived in. Or, anyway, that is what Victoria Blackwell believed. One night he was late coming home. There was no fighting, No shouting. At no cost. Two persons sat face to face across a dining table that had suddenly seemed so much broader than it had been. Thomas Blackwell clasped his hands, a gesture she knew all too well. That was his position before difficult chats. "We have to have a straight talk," he remarked. Victoria Blackwell knew what was coming and she wasn't going to enjoy it, but that was different. She looked at him. "What things?" Thomas Blackwell inhaled. "The company, the family, our future." The words did not come easily. They were not mean or anything. They were weighed up. Measured phrases give absolutely little scope of misunderstanding. For the next hour they talked of consequences neither had considered a month before. Investors were jittery. There were worried partners. Clients asked questions. Workers raised concerns. Victoria Blackwell remained seated. Thomas Blackwell never raised his voice. Never did he offend her, but she had come out of the conversation more disturbed than he. For each statement contained an uneasy truth. There is no such thing as a vacuum. They bred households. Among businesses, between communities. Years gone, later that night, Victoria Blackwell stood by the large windows overlooking the city. New York City was twinkling under her as it always did. Thousands of lights, millions of lives, so many stories all at once. For years, she had thought success equaled permanence. That success might ensure belonging. Such status may buffer people from uncertainty. She saw how flimsy their assumptions had been. A name could end up in the crapper. You can change a name, relationships hurt. Not overnight, but slowly, quietly. No electricity, and, most cruel of all, she was beginning to realize that the worst losses were not monetary. Money can be got back. Businesses could snap back, could sell the properties again, buy them back. But this time it was a different sort of trust. Trust took longer, more humanized, improved, and when broken, it required practice, something Victoria Blackwell had never quite got the hang of. Humility. Her phone lay still on the kitchen counter. Almost midnight. Eliza Blackwell did not say anything. No invitations. There is no breaking business news. Nada. Silence. For the first time in years, Victoria Blackwell had no vital place to go. No one was there to meet her. No plan could fix what had been broken. She stood in the empty apartment, staring out over the city she thought she knew. And for the first time, she understood how dreadful it was to lose status. It was heartbreaking to lose communication. And now she was only just beginning to sense the difference. The strange thing about losing it all is that the globe continues to turn. The sun rises once more. Airports are still busy with travelers, still running the early morning coffee cafes, still laughing children, people still fall in love. And somehow, even if you feel like you're the focus of your own devastation, life was never about you. More than a year after Flight 237, there were few now that recalled the name of Victoria Blackwell. The internet was different now. The news cycle had passed on to other outrages. The objects of wrath turned became new public figures. One legend had been supplanted by another, ancient and modern. The world did what the world did. It went on. Victoria Blackwell currently lives in a little apartment outside of Chicago. Gone was the fancy high-rise building with the view of Manhattan. The private gatherings were over. The invites had stopped coming so totally that she often wondered if they had ever come at all. It was a bit quieter these days, as it should be normal, and she despised that word for a long while. Normal. It sounded like a bust. She had lived her life for decades in achievement, in access, in influence, in renown. She was not the woman she had been. No one ever knew her name. No one asked her. No one needs her approval. The hush was unendurable at first, and then normal. It turned out to be something different. Liberty. She would not say it straight. Every morning she traveled to a rental car facility near car rental counter near O'Hare International Airport. That was an easy job. Customers walked in. The paperwork was complete. Keys handed out. Questions answered. Fix the bug. Not flash. Nothing major. Anything more someone could publish online. But the simplicity was doing something to her. For the first time in decades, people approached her not knowing who she was. It did not matter to the consumers where she lived. It didn't matter what charities she'd supported. They did not care who her husband was. They did not care whether she could aid them. That was all there was to it. No position. No hierarchy. Just men. Victoria Blackwell was uneasy at first. Then she thought it was a strange sort of honesty. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a woman walked into the office with a sleeping toddler in her arms. She carried a diaper bag, a handbag, and a rental agreement on her shoulder with the child. She looked worn out, not fatigued in a dramatic sense, tired, for real. The kind of commitment that sucks the life out of you day after day with no round of applause. Victoria Blackwell watched her work at the papers. A year ago, she would not have seen it, or maybe she would have picked it up and put it away right away. But then it happened something else. She has just seen her. The woman, the assignment, the weight she bore. Victoria Blackwell walked around the counter without thinking. "Here," she whispered. "Let me help you." The woman looked surprised, then relaxed. Victoria Blackwell picked up the luggage, folded the stroller, and packed everything into the vehicle for the next 5 minutes. Not much to boast about, no chivalry. But as the woman thanked her, Victoria Blackwell felt something she had not felt in a long time. Helpful. Never mind, did not like helpful, and that was all. A few weeks afterwards, there was another encounter with her. A new person has come into the office. His name was Marcus Johnson, a quiet man in his early 40s who didn't speak much about himself. Most people spoke to him politely but briefly. Victoria Blackwell was the first to do it. One time they just occurred to close the business together amid a snowstorm. The discourse was informal in the first place. Weather, traffic, weekend plans, and somehow it stirred. "I work 2 jobs," Marcus Johnson added, supporting his mom, helping pay for his daughter's education expenditures. Victoria Blackwell listened. There were few details, no outstanding speech, no music to lighten the spirits, just life, the kind of life millions of people live every day. Listening, she learned something frightening. There were times when she had made up her mind about people before getting stories like this. Not that she considered herself unkind. She considered herself an observer. Observation is frequently just assumption in a nicer suit without the knowledge. It weighed on her chest. That night, driving home in the pouring snow, she thought of all the persons she had studied from afar for years. How many stories she never heard? How many issues she never imagined? How many conclusions had she assumed? The questions were stacking up, and she was not so ready to answer them as she had been previously. She permitted them to remain. A couple months later, Marcus Johnson brought several of his co-workers to a community health fair being hosted by his church. Victoria Blackwell would have said no. She didn't dislike community events or anything, for she would have felt them foreign to her life. She did this time. It was a change in her, not all in one go, not much, but deep. She spent the day leading travelers to registration tables, family advice, materials, catering, listening. Mostly just listening, and that was something else, because it is easier to judge than to listen. It takes perspective to judge. To listen is to be humble. One late afternoon, Grace Combs approached one of the booths, clutching her grandfather's hand. Mr. Walter Combs with a staff walked slowly. The boy never let him go. She slowed down to match his pace. Every single step, every single break, every motion. Victoria Blackwell looked at them for a few seconds and then for longer. The picture seemed to cling to her. It wasn't anything special, which it was not. It was an easy job. Respectfulness, basic love. Things she'd have dismissed for years in pursuit of broader definitions of success. Driving home that night, she saw something she had never really seen before. Character is finely built. In the conference rooms? No. Not on social media. Not fame. Character is built in the small, daily moments when no one is watching. Help someone with a load. Listen. Don't make a guess. Respect without expecting thanks. The lessons seemed excruciatingly elementary, but they were changing her more than any public consequence could. For the first time since the flight, Victoria Blackwell did not see her life as a story of what she had lost. It was starting to look like a story of what she had not learned, and what she still had time to discover today, perhaps in the end. On Flight 237, the woman felt a person's worth was determined by their place. The woman trudged home through the A-modest apartment in the Chicago suburbs now, and noticed something else. Status can be an entry, but it's character you come out with when you get through to them. And for the first time in years, Victoria Blackwell was more interested in piecing herself back together than saving her reputation. 3 years after Flight 237, Victoria Blackwell wasn't waiting for her former life to return. That epiphany didn't happen overnight. It had been built slowly through everyday mornings and quiet days at work, and hundreds of moments that would never end up in a newspaper headline or on a social media post. Once she'd defined success in terms of access and influence, and spent years learning how to live without, and she had ceased to count what she had lost on the way. Not that the losses did not still count. Her narrative was not her story anymore. That communication arrived Thursday night. Victoria Blackwell returned home from work. Somewhere outside, a gentle spring rain was tapping on her apartment window as she set her keys on the kitchen counter and checked her phone. She almost missed it at first. The sender's name was her name, and it froze her, Eliza Blackwell. She could only look for a few seconds. No go. Do not open it. Just breathing. There have been sporadic communications over the years, short Christmas messages, a few acknowledgments, reserved talk, distant but respectful. There was still enough evidence to prove there was a link, but not enough to fix what used to be there. That was something else. Victoria Blackwell sat down and opened it out. Her hands trembled a bit. In itself, the message was rather short. That was Eliza Blackwell's way of talking now, straight ahead. No, I mean it. I'm ready to take a little step, Mom. Victoria Blackwell looked over the sentence again, then 3 times, her eyes suddenly filled with tears. It wasn't always fixed, though. It hadn't. Not even on the same planet. No way. The message went on. You have got a good boy. His name was Oliver. He is now 2 years old. Victoria Blackwell's hand went to her mouth. A grandson. Aged 2 years. She was standing outside looking in, but a full human life had begun. It was painful to know, but that pain was a relief. Even for the first time, she heard what she had missed, not from anybody else. She inherited it from her daughter. The email went on. I am not writing you to say all is well. It is not so. I write to you having observed your actions over the past few years through people in whom I trust. I know you have been working on it. I know the adjustments were not temporary. Victoria Blackwell shut her eyes. Those remarks were more than forgiving because they witnessed the labor. Not exactly. No salvation. Labor, the most sincere money in the growth of man. That last paragraph was easy. We would appreciate it if you would like to come to London, England this summer. No expectations, no guarantees. Just a visit. Victoria Blackwell was quiet a long time after she finished the message. Outside, it was still raining. Memories were forming inside her brain. The flight to the airport, fall, the loneliness, the years of convalescence. The tough talks, the little decisions that nobody ever cheered. Helping out strangers. Listen more, less a judgment. Learning slowly, learning badly. Anyway, studying. For the first time in years she cried without shame. Not grief. Thanks. Victoria Blackwell stood at an airport terminal some months later. But it did not feel right. Years before she'd walked through JFK believing control would shield her from the unpredictable. Now she knew that not knowing was merely the human condition. There was a small present in her bag. Nothing out of the ordinary. Not fancy. I'm not trying to impress you. It was only a collection of children's books selected with infinite care by herself. Tales of kindness, wonder, friendship, stories she hoped her grandson might enjoy one day. The simplicity of the gift would have horrified her previous self. That made her grin. Her pulse pounded harder than it ever had at any board meeting, any charity gala, any social event she would ever attend when her flight touched down in London, England. Status is so much scarier than vulnerability. Everything's under control. Vulnerability? There is no way. She walked carefully through the arrivals hall. She was surrounded with passengers. Families hugged. Friends laughed. Children ran into open arms. Victoria Blackwell paused a moment to think if she should mention Eliza Blackwell out of hand. Then she spotted her and knew there will be a few items missing. They have one daughter. Eliza Blackwell was standing by the barrier, carrying a young boy with dark blonde hair. Oliver. Victoria Blackwell halted. The toddler watched the crowd with interest, not knowing the past he was fighting against. No knowledge of errors, of results, of regret, of reform. Kids are good at that. They meet individuals before they pass judgment. Victoria Blackwell's eyes again filled with tears. Eliza Blackwell came first. Not going. No real drama. Just a few careful moves. The divide between them remained, but it was not infinite. Hi, Ma, Eliza Blackwell murmured quietly. Victoria Blackwell grinned, and the tears ran down her face. Hello. Neither knew quite what to say next. That was all right. You do not build all the bridges in one talk. Sometimes repair begins with presence, not words. Eliza Blackwell put Oliver down on the ground a little later. The small kid gazed up at Victoria Blackwell. Then to his mother, then the other way. He took a few timid steps forward, not knowing the importance of the occasion. Children know hardly any history. They know how to turn on. Cool safety. Heat. Victoria Blackwell sank slowly to her knees, not wanting to burden him too much, did not want to push it. Oliver examined her intently. Then he took out a little miniature aeroplane he had been carrying, and voila, a simple gesture. Just a regular minute, but Victoria Blackwell felt a change inside her. Because an airplane was the symbol of all she'd lost years ago, now a toy airplane in the palm of a child who stood for everything she might still get. Do not know, not total forgiveness, not a resurrection of the old, something else. The possibility that night, walking with the family in a quiet park in Hyde Park, London, England, Victoria Blackwell recognized a reality she believed she might have learned long ago. You don't often get the opportunity to erase your mistakes in life. But if they're prepared to change, it's a chance to write a better chapter moving forward. The future was still uncharted. Building trust takes time. Relations would continue to improve at a snail's pace. Some of them didn't disappear completely, and that was okay. Redemption is not a destination. It's a technique. Victoria Blackwell looked from her daughter to her grandchild and then up at the night sky above London, England. For years now, she has been trying to get prestige, power, and acceptance. Now she had something far more frail to love, and much more meaningful. Her second shot at being the woman she was meant to be, for above 30,000 feet. Prestige is lost, but character is still there. We learned respect should never be based on income, status, appearance, or heritage. One moment of pride, prejudice, or wrong decision may have ramifications far beyond anything we can anticipate. But the narrative also indicates that people may change if they're prepared to look at their failings with humility and honesty. Let us give every individual dignity in our day-to-day life. Let us listen before we condemn. Let us not assume success will open doors for you, but character will determine what you do behind the doors. How we treat people today is the life we shall live tomorrow. Never underestimate respect. When all the titles, money, and position are gone, the world will remember how we made people feel.